Hi everyone, this is Navika Chada, a cloud engineer and a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in Developers Technology. I warmly welcome each one of you to the 8th episode of Tech Chat with Navika, wherein today we would be discussing about Azure landing zones. And to share some expertise on it, we have a very prominent speaker with us today, Mr. Simon. Simon is a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in Azure category for consecutive 7 years. He is currently working as a Chief Technical Architect at Advania Knowledge Factory, Sweden. Having more than 15 years of experience in the IT field, he is into strategizing, designing, and implementing the modern architecture. Being a MCT, Simon is passionate about hosting, conducting the user groups, technical sessions, teaching PowerShell, Azure, and the list goes on and on. Thank you so much, Simon, for joining in me today.
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to have you. So, I am pretty much looking forward to this session, and I just cannot wait to get started. So, shall we?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So, Simon, we are seeing off lately many organizations and companies are migrating to Azure Cloud specifically, right? And as they do so, it is of utmost priority and importance to have a strong foundation in place, right? A foundation in the terms of cloud environment or cloud architecture, which should actually be supported by the pillars of, let's suppose, security, identity, governance, etc., etc. And as we talk about that strong framework in place, that's where Azure Landing Zone come into the picture. So to start with, can you just throw some light onto it as to what Azure Landing Zones are all about for the people who are pretty much new to it?
Yes, absolutely. So, usually when we start talking with customers, and historically, uh, when we were building stuff in Azure and things were just kind of growing organically, a lot of companies started with like creating a subscription in Azure and they built something and then they created another one and then they built that one and it kind of grew and became this like archipelago of systems. So you have like a whole bunch of different IT systems and they have grown organically. You created one and then another one and another one. And there is very little standard and organization. And at some point, the environment grows large enough to be a pain to manage. So I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Microsoft wrote something that today is called the Cloud Adoption Framework. It's a fairly large framework, so it contains all the questions that you as an organization needs to ask yourself, like why are we going to the cloud? What do we do? Which kind of requirements do we have? What are our main goals and motivators? And that framework is really good, but it was a bit hard to build something just on this fairly big framework. So a little bit later, Microsoft announced something called Enterprise Scale Architecture, which was a handful of reference implementations. So then we suddenly had an example like this is how you could actually implement the principles in the cloud adoption framework. And that scale architecture has later been renamed to Azure Landing Zones. So Azure Landing Zones is kind of a reference implementation or an example of how you could build your architecture in Azure or your platform in Azure in a way that is resilient, robust, scalable, and where you can have both good freedom for individual teams, but also good governance and good security.
All right. So basically, Azure Landing Zone, in a way, we can say it sort of helps us efficiently manage the performance in a way, or manage the resources, the organization of the
Yes.
resources,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And it gives us
It's
a guide for how we can build something in a fairly standardized way. And if a lot of us are building in the same standardized way, it's fairly easy to kind of reuse learnings and implementations between companies and organizations.
Got it. Got it. Um, as you just mentioned in your previous answer about certain design patterns or the recommendations that are provided, right? Definitely, if while the cloud migration is going on, so any organization, when they're in this planning or rather in the designing phase, right, of the cloud architecture, the framework, and definitely all organizations strive for the most optimum design, right, which caters to the needs and requirement. In that case, can you just share some design patterns that organizations should keep into consideration, which could be beneficial to them while they create an architecture?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the beginning, like once you set up your kind of platform architecture, a lot of the principle and guidance are about how should we manage control, like governance controls and access controls. So we in general in Azure landing zones we create kind of a hierarchy of management groups. So in Azure we have resources. A resource could be a server or a database or a storage account or something. Resources resides in resource groups. Resource groups resides in subscriptions, and subscriptions resides in management groups.
Right.
So, and the management group, we can nest in, I think, up to 5 layers. So we usually build some kind of hierarchy where we have like one top level corporate root or base level, and then we divide that into various categories. And the first thing we usually discuss with customers that are about to build a national landing zone architecture structure is to separate between kind of platform management things and more regular workload kind of things. So in the Azure Land Zones example, we have a corporate management group up on top, and then we have a split between platform stuff and landing zones. And in the platform stuff or in the platform management group, we usually put kind of shared platform resources in the company. So that's where we have like central networking components, PKI infrastructure, maybe centralized DNS solutions, identity solutions, and automation and management stuff used to automate the platform as a whole.
Hmm.
And on the other leg, so to say, we have the landing zones um, part of the platform, and that can be divided into different archetypes, basically different flavors of IT systems.
Okay.
So in Cloud Ocean Framework, they often talk about online and corp, or we sometimes call them connected and online or external. So we can split between systems that are connected and integrated to our like internal networks and that integrates into our hybrid environment, and systems that are more standalone, that live in their own bubble and have like their own internet connectivity. And then
Mm-hmm.
we sometimes have other archetypes that are special kind of flavors or places where we need to yeah, systems that don't really fit into any of the other categories. So, and by doing this first division in both centrally managed things and systems that are probably managed or owned by individual teams or department or something, uh, we already there have a good way of scaling, because then we can assign policies. So policies in Azure are always inherited downwards. Most things are inherited downwards. So we can put
Mm-hmm.
governance controls on top saying these are the rules that applies to all our company. And then we can say these are some rules that only apply for like the central, what we used to call the IT department, like the teams responsible for central management. And
Mm-hmm.
then we have rules that are like, these is our standard rules for other applications. And within those other applications, we can then deploy one subscription per environment per system usually. So If we
Mhm.
boil it down to a single team
Mm.
having responsibility for a single application, we can usually give that team 3 subscriptions, maybe one for development, one for testing, and one for production. And we can assign access to these subscriptions individually, meaning that a team can have full access to manage and maintain and operate a system within their subscriptions. They can do pretty much anything they want, as
Right.
long as they move within the boundaries of the guardrails that are configured on a higher level.
Mm.
So that the way we can design a good kind of guardrail or carve out some boundaries. Like, this is
Mm.
something that is not allowed, or these are the things that you can do. And as long as the team stays within those boundaries, they are free to do whatever they want. So that can give us agility, that can make our company move faster, because the individual team can innovate and iterate faster, at the same
Mm.
time as like a compliance or security department can have good trust in that we won't break any laws or any requirements from for governance reasons.
Right. Right.
Think-
And as you just mentioned about Azure policies, and as you just mentioned about the subscriptions, etc., as to how we can integrate security also into our system, like assign it to a team, right? So that everything works fine. In that
yeah.
case, we can go much deeper resource level as well, right? Or sort of we can go ahead with the RBAC roles and all, which sort of take care of the security at much at a deeper level as well.
Yes, absolutely. And since the RBAC assignments and access controls are inherited downwards, we can have kind of security operations controls teams or security teams that have read access on a higher level, and that can do
Mhm.
queries and get like give me all the resources that have this certain configuration in our whole environment. But we can
Right.
also delegate granular controls to individual teams where they can have the delegated responsibility to basically manage and maintain everything. And
Correct.
more security operations and the compliance team can focus on doing audit activities and so on.
Correct. Correct. Um, as now, like we have sort of spoken about what it is all about and what Azure Landing Zones is all about, where you've covered the why part of it as well, and along with the design plan that you've sort of shared in such an in-depth one. Um, let's talk a little bit more about implementation front, right? So when organizations wish to implement this entire thing. I think implementation sort of really varies from organization to organization, the implementation strategy,
Yeah,
because there are different factors that determines it. For example, it could be as small as maybe the team skill sets of the team members, right? It could be the needs and requirement at a particular time frame. Um, and depending on that, maybe an organization wants to go in for a very rich implementation, maybe of a landing zone at the first place. Or on
yeah,
the other hand, it could also be some organization wants a very basic one at the first place, and then maybe they can scale it with time, which is a possibility again. So can you just share your opinion on what are the different types of implementation strategies in terms of or we can say what are different types of Azure landing zones implementation options in a way.
yeah, absolutely. So there are a few different flavors or sizes of the landing zone architecture. Um, we usually go for the kind of enterprise architecture. My opinion is that you should kind of aim for the platform design with as much functionality as possible in your design, but you can choose to kind of say, yeah, this part we don't need that right now. Let's leave space for it. Let's leave an empty piece here. But as long as you kind of design for a large and scalable platform, you can always have that choice in the future. So that's the kind of choosing the design. When it comes to implementation, there are a few reference implementations you can use. So Microsoft provides what they are calling accelerators. You can use a bicep accelerator, you can use an ARM template accelerator, and you can use a Terraform accelerator, which is basically pre-made code that you can just download, put in your environment, supply some parameters, and deploy it. 20 minutes later, you have a full Azure Landing Zone implementation. I find those implementations amazing for like learning about how you should design something, and I find it really great to deploy it to use for demo purposes and for getting started purposes. I'm a bit torn when it comes to actual production implementation, depending on the size of your organization and the maturity of your organization, because deploying something like taking more or less one script or one code base and just like downloading it and deploying it as a whole is super good to get you started within minutes. But
Right.
when it comes to kind of day two operations, a week later, a month later, 6 months later, and you want to kind of evolve this and make it your own and do changes and adaptations to a platform, then you need to have a very deep understanding of the code base, especially if you want to keep keep maintaining the platform. Because usually when we deploy something, we try to use infrastructure as code. We mainly use Bicep, sometimes we use Terraform, but the main purpose or main goal is that no human should ever have direct modify access to the platform. So every time I need to change something, I go into a Git repository, I propose a change using something called a pull request, and one of my colleagues or a manager or an architect or someone approves that pull request. It gets merged into the common code base, and then it gets deployed by a pipeline, which means we have full traceability: who did what, who approved it, why did it happen, and so on. And if I'm going to use that kind of approach and always do all my changes by changing the actual infrastructure, if I have this humongous code base which I have to go in and kind of edit and perform all my changes in the future, the it requires a lot of understanding of that code base, and I need to have a really good understanding of what should I change and how should I change it. And there is also a risk that that the change has effect on a larger scope than absolutely necessary. So for customers that are kind of invested into building this Azure Landing Zones architecture platform, we usually recommend them to use the example code as kind of baseline, copy the things you need, and try to adapt it and make it your own. Because if you do the effort in the beginning to kind of rewrite it and make it something that you know and understand and that fits your organization, then you will have a lot easier time to actually manage and maintain changes to that platform in the future.
Right. You're right. In fact, as you just talk about templates and infrastructure as a code,
Yes.
I just recall that in fact my last event was based on this only, on on IAC, and that's what, as you just explained, I guess. When you work in IAC, when you build an entire infrastructure using IAC, which includes whatever ARM templates, biceps, PowerShell scripts, it really helps you streamline the entire process, right? I mean, and even then, when you're using ARM templates or whatsoever bicep, you can always automate it. You can always make it dynamic as well, right? Make it in a way that you don't have to go inside the code every time and change the parameters or the variables. right? So we have an option of making it entirely dynamic. And of course, with the help of CI/CD pipelines, Azure DevOps in that case, I guess it sort of really streamlines the entire process of automation. Just one click and everything gets deployed, and we don't have to really get into it again and again.
Exactly.
But as you just correctly mentioned, it's very important to have a good understanding of what we are creating, right? So
Yeah.
so as you just mentioned, so can we call that a basic infrastructure that then, like when you are creating, because accelerator is something that within minutes things get created, it's like
Yep.
a quick way of getting it done.
It is.
But contrary to that, if we are making, so we can call it a basic implementation strategy then, right?
Yep.
Which can be scaled at any further point of time if need
Yeah.
be.
Absolutely.
All right. Apart from the skill sets, like if we differentiate between these two implementation strategy, a very impromptu question, um there is no cost factor included any which ways, right? Or is it between
Well,
accelerator or the normal, the basic one?
we don't pay anything for the accelerator code, but
Okay.
we do pay for the resources that are deployed by the code.
Obviously,
So if we are using the larger accelerator or the more complete accelerator, they involve things like Azure firewalls or virtual WAN hubs or maybe application gateways and so on, uh, which are or which will incur a fair amount of cost. And
okay.
that brings us to another part of the governance part, which is cost control. It's
Yeah.
in the accelerator we have a lot of examples on how we can deploy automatic budgets and budgets alert and make sure that everyone has a set of budgets. So whenever my application or the part of the infrastructure that I own and is responsible for, I can
Mhm.
get like emails or alerts when you're now I'm 50% of my budget and now I'm forecasted to pass my budget at the end of the month and so on. So
Right.
that's also a very important part to have in mind, I think, early in the process.
Definitely, because that is one of the reasons why people actually move to cloud, right? Because it's cost efficient, and that is very important to sort of configure all the alerts and monitor everything, right? And as you just mentioned, if we are having alerts in place, 50% cost reach or 80 or 90%, we always have an option of scaling certain things down if it's
Yeah,
not a need, and we can take action accordingly. That's
yeah.
absolutely right. That's absolutely right. One question which I'm very pretty much curious to know, when we talk about accelerator, right? um is it's like the entire thing just gets deployed, or do we have an option of customizing certain things in it, maybe something, a particular resource which I do not need at this point, so I can remove that? Is there
Yeah,
an option? Okay.
absolutely. So depending on which of the accelerators you use, but if you
Mm-hmm.
use the basic like the ARM or the basic ones, at least you can choose either to download the code and just keep the templates that deploys the things you want, or you can do the kind of wizard experience where you can just click through a wizard and choose what you want or what you don't want. So um, in the ARM template deployment experience, you get like a custom um, deployment graphical user interface. So just like when you create a resource in
Yeah.
Azure Portal,
Right.
you can click through and say, I want this kind of network solution and this kind of
Mm-hmm.
size of it, and say yes or no on every page and say what you want and what you don't want. The
Perfect.
problem with
So,
those with the accelerator and using the wizard approach though is that you will run the infrastructure as code from the public Microsoft place or download it
mhm,
and run it, but the the parameters that you specify is the things you put in the wizard, and that won't be committed to your Git repository. So
that's right.
it's a great experience for just like setting up something, getting to know it, and kind of diving into how things works. But once it's time to do an actual like production environment,
Mm-hmm.
I I really prefer kind of downloading the code and actually writing the parameter values into to files and deploy it with a pipeline.
Right.
Of course, we can do the same, like choose which parts to deploy and which not to deploy, but in that case, we put it into parameter files instead of doing the
Correct.
wizard approach.
Yeah, that is right. And that's the reason why I asked was that can really help us get down on the cost then, right? It will sort of
Absolutely.
eliminate certain. That was
Yeah.
the reason specifically why I asked this question. Even from the
Yeah,
US point
absolutely.
of view, because we can then just lower down on the cost. Because
Yeah.
I guess there would be many people who would go in for accelerator at the first place. That okay, everything gets deployed quickly,
Yeah.
but then also you have an option of choosing and not choosing the resources according to your needs and requirements.
Absolutely.
Um, that is an advantage definitely,
Yeah.
which saves your time and money both.
It does. And this is
Right.
like we've been running a lot of companies have been running Azure for a long time, but for some companies it's fairly new as well. And
Mm-hmm.
the mindset of like I'm suddenly only paying for stuff that I am running is a bit hard to wrap your head around, even though it sounds very logical or natural to say it. But the fact to
Yeah,
say like, yeah, we're actually scaling down or closing down or turning off systems that we don't need, maybe in the night or during weekends, it can save a lot of money.
a lot. Right. That's true, and that is the reason, as you mentioned, alertings and all these are like practices which we
Yeah,
should maintain in a small infra or a big infra. It doesn't matter.
absolutely.
It's
Yeah,
something that we should always maintain. Right. That's all from my side. All the questions you have answered, I myself got to learn so much from it. And thank you so much once again. By the way, do you want to share any signing off note? Something you want
no, well, try out the Azure Landsons if you haven't. Take one of the accelerators, deploy it in a lab environment. I think you need like 5 subscriptions, and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. And you can
to?
deploy it and remove the parts that are expensive, and then run it just for practicing governance or security. So make sure you have at least one Azure Landsons environment for testing and educational purposes.
Absolutely right. So, guys who are watching, try it out right away. And thank you so much, Simon. Once again, it was an extremely insightful session, and I got to learn a lot. And I'm sure the people who are going to watch this, it's going to turn out to be very informative and educative for them, especially hearing the expertise from such knowledgeable and a learned person like you. So,
Thank
thank
you
you
very
so
much for
much.
having me.
Thank you so much for joining me in today. And it was a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much.